If you spoke to anyone who's been involved in the fight to safeguard the future of our NHS over the last decades, 20, maybe even longer, I can't remember, Professor Allyson Pollock's name comes up immediately. Not just for her research and written works, which are considerable contribution, but as someone who has passionately fought for NHS and the health care system as a right in Britain and throughout the world. Before Labour came to power, and when they did, she fought tirelessly against the market system they introduced into the NHS and private finance solution. She did this to stop the Carolines and Virgins of this world coming into being and to rip off our NHS, and since. When the coalition threw a grenade into the NHS, coalition government of 2010 threw a grenade into the NHS with their 2012 Health and Social Care Act. She was one of the authors of the new reinstatement bill, which has galvanised a lot of opposition at Westminster to save the NHS. More recently, she's worked on the accountable care organisations, was one of those who launched the judicial review. This was one of the most boldest judicial reviews, in our opinion, ever seen, taking on the government on the question of law and their attempt to Americanise the system, even ignoring their own legislation. This cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, and she was partnered in this by one of the most famous physicists, Stephen Hawking. Sadly, Stephen Hawking has now passed away, but together they forced the government to confine its activities to changes to within their own legislation. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Allyson Pollock.
This isn't working. I don't know how it's worked out. Thank you, Roger. Can you all hear me? Do come closer if you feel like it. As Roger said, my name is Allyson Pollock, and I currently work in Newcastle University, and I started off my life in medicine. Then I've worked for about 20 years between the NHS and academia, and now I work most of the time in this ivory tower. So it's very nice to come out and see you today, and very kind of you not to prefer the beach to this hall and my talk. I'm not going to talk for very long. Can you all hear? Yes. Put up your hands if you can't, and put up your hands if anything I say is unclear. I'm not going to talk for very long. I think this campaign is a very important campaign. It's one of hundreds that are going on all around the country, invisible to everybody except in their local areas, because our press doesn't bother, even in local areas, with campaigns like this, and that's partly what's been happening to our press, and partly also because there's usually only one stringer, one journalist, and they're desperately trying to fill a whole newspaper. But I think your campaign is important, and our health services are the life and soul, are the lifeblood of our local communities. And of course, you will have heard every excuse under the sun for the changes that you're fighting against, and certainly there's nothing new that I haven't heard. And we're at an extraordinary moment politically. The NHS, as you all know, came into being at an extraordinary moment in history in 1948, when the country was absolutely broke and on its knees, capital was broke, and the whole country had to be rebuilt, literally. So, of course, the NHS was one of the 5 pillars of the welfare state, one of the 5 giants: education, welfare, pensions, housing, and employment, all really important pieces of the welfare state. And gradually, over the last 30, 35 years, that consensus about what it means to be a society has been broken by our politicians. Not by ourselves, but, well, by ourselves because we voted in the wrong politicians. And what we've seen, as you know, over the last 30 years is increasing attrition, culminating in austerity following the financial crash in 2008, and governments which have become consciously cruel, whether it be welfare cuts, the bedroom tax, cuts in our education services, or cuts to our schools. And this conscious cruelty also it extends to the cruelty to our communities through what they're doing to our local authorities. The huge swindling cuts that are taking place in local authorities, which means now we no longer have freedom from fear. So if we have children who have disabilities, or if we ourselves have disabilities, we can no longer know what to expect and what we will be entitled to. And I actually think that the local authorities should now be publishing every year the services they can no longer provide because of the devastating cuts. When you lose 30% out of your budgets, you have a responsibility to your local community not to say, we can manage change, we can do things better, we'll manage. They should be publishing list after list after list of the services that are not provided, and the list after list of the list of the people and their children who are no longer getting services. This area we know is an area where there is a lot of inequalities in wealth, but also extreme poverty. And in many areas, including this area, almost 50% of the children are living below the poverty line. So that means they're going without clothes, on some days they're not being fed, and school may be the only source of food for them. And these are all the ingredients for an unhealthy society. When you have the stress and anxiety of how you bring money home, the stress and anxiety of how you feed your children, how you get housing, how you get benefits, these make for all the ingredients of a return to the five giants of disease, poverty and despair. And this is why this campaign and these campaigns are so important, because they inject hope back into our community. It's really important that we galvanise, and these councils should be publishing not just the list of services they're providing, but also the names of the people that they're taking away services from or denying care to. And I think we should be having a very different campaign on top of the ones that Roger's doing. These are important to save our hospitals and our services, but we need to begin to expose who isn't getting care. Because we have the invisible hand of the market. And what the invisible hand of the market means, those who can afford to pay in the marketplace get care. Those who can afford services get care. And those who can't will increasingly do without. So I think our councils have a responsibility to tell the public what's going on, to put posters out every single month and in the press to say how much the cuts are and what the consequences of the cuts are. I've only seen one council do that, that's in Tower Hamlets in London, but I think we should be doing it all over the country and mobilising our public. On top of the cuts, what we have is a policy of the last 30 years of deliberate privatisation. And of course that comes from the new Labour government, which came into power under Tony Blair, when the philosophy was, it doesn't matter who provides the services so long as they're publicly funded. So what we've had is the incremental privatisation. As Roger said, we had contracting out and tendering, compulsory tendering, mainly for the non-unionised staff, mainly women, low-paid worker, cleaners, catering staff and porters, and we saw that all through the 1980s. By 1990s, early 1990s, we had what was called the Private Finance Initiative, where the government changed the whole system of accounting in 1990 and created this purchaser-provider split so that hospitals and services would have to compete against each other for contracts, and hospitals now, which were falling into terrible decay and disrepair, would only be funded through something called project finance, or the private finance initiative. A policy that is totally discredited because it's tying in your children and grandchildren now for the next 60 years into exorbitant debts. And now the government's looking for alternative sources of funding, so trying to persuade the councils to raise bonds to finance hospitals or services. This money, even these reserves, should be used now for the public immediately. They should not be tied in to new forms of project finance. So we had the internal market, which was breaking everything up, and that paved the way for increasing marketisation. And when the government can't persuade you, you no longer need your hospitals and services, they do it in different ways. They merge the hospitals together, trusts, because it makes it much easier to close them, because you don't need the same forms of consultation, and you bring all these hospitals, the trust CEOs, together, and they decide that they no longer need a bit of what was once two hospitals, is now one big corporate entity. And these corporate entities have new powers. They have new powers to get into joint ventures and privatise their staff. But also remember, these trusts, these foundation trusts, are nearly 50% private. Up to 50% of their funds can be raised through charging and private income. And that means nearly 50% of the beds and the services and the staff can go out to private income. Now, in an area like this, nobody can afford to pay privately. Even in Sunderland, most people cannot afford any kind of private medicine. And the other thing that the government has done is it's laden these trusts, because in a period of austerity, they're supposed to break even, instead of which they have enormous debts sitting on their balance sheets. So Tyneside and Sunderland hospitals, they both have debts, and in merging them, they brought these debts together, called a deficit, and the only way out of the deficit is to close hospitals, sell off the land, and close services. So really what you're seeing here is a microcosm of a much bigger picture, which has been about how governments are managing to transform the system from a public universal service to one where increasingly they can persuade the public we can't afford it, and so now you must either start to pay or go without. And in areas like this, where there's not a lot of wealth, you will go without, and some of you may be fortunate to have private health insurance or to be able to afford to pay, or you'll go without, or you will travel and sit on waiting lists for Sunderland Hospital. And I looked at the geography. It's bad enough getting to this place in the centre of Newcastle, but what that will actually mean. And of course what the government does in, am I going on too long? No. So what the government does is, the real story is the money is stupid. I think that was Reagan said that, but it's the money story. It's basically the government is setting up the NHS to fail. It's setting up, landing with huge deficits, and then it's putting in the mechanisms to enable it to close services and generate more money. And that is what this whole big piece of legislation was in 2012, the Health and Social Care Act. And that's why now, that's why, as Roger said, the only way we can get our NHS back is by a new Act of Parliament, which is why we've spent the last 6 years drafting bills and trying to get them into Parliament. But the chaos in Parliament at the moment, because of Brexit, means that nobody is focusing on domestic policy. The civil servants are basically doing whatever they want, and there's nobody in Parliament to call them to account. Increasingly, And partly because of Brexit, but also because of the multinationals, our democracy is broken. There is nobody calling this government and the civil service to account. And Parliament is the only body that can call the government to account. And yet Parliament is not doing its work at the moment. And that's because of the debacle over the Brexit that's been going on. So now that we have to fight locally, that's where we have to go. We have to do our best to try and get Parliament to listen, as Emma did with her statement and debates, but nobody really cares, and I bet that chamber was nearly empty when she gave that statement. So we have to fight locally, and we have to make our local councils much more accountable, and they should be calling out what's actually happening with the health service and not capitulating. And I think you've done an amazing job doing that here, locally. The other thing that you will be told is not just we can't afford it anymore, but we can't get the staffing, and staffing is a problem, but there are all sorts of imaginative ways of doing it. And the other thing that you'll be told is the services are no longer viable. And over the last 30 years, I've been doing this work for a long, long time, really since PFI, so I've heard every story and every excuse in the sun, including the European Working Time Directive, where that doesn't stop people doing double shifts or triple shifts if they want to moonlight in the private sector. I've heard every story that the services are no longer viable, we can't get the staff. If the political will is there, all of this can happen. The solutions are there. That's the lazy reply. It's not affordable. We can't get the staff. We can't do the shifts. The services are no longer viable. We've got a perfectly good service. We need to centralise and build up. These are very lazy, glib answers that have been honed over 30 years. You'll hear them on every platform that the CEOs and all their array of managers sit. They'll give you this, they've trained, they've gone to management college, they hear the management speak from the King's Fund, from the Nuffield. They've all been carefully honed, like clones really, to give the same responses. And you need to challenge that. You need to take them, as Roger has done, and all the campaign group. I mean, your websites are great, the information you give out. You need to keep taking them on. And I'm really sad that the children's emergency care has been withdrawn. So from 10, you're seeing a gradual whittling away after 10 o'clock at night. The nurse-led midwifery service, well, that's great, but we all know what happens there. So I think, you have to continue fighting. You have to get to the young people. I mean, this is great having this community centre, but we need this hall to be full of young people. If the climate change activists can get them out, the Gretas out on the streets, we need some young people here. We need them to realise what they're losing. And the problem is, of course, most young people are very well, and they really don't know what's around the corner. Some aren't so well, but that it can hit us all. But I think what you're doing is absolutely amazing, and all the street work that you do as well, Roger, because that's where it is. It's all on the ground. And the tide will turn. The tide is turning. And actually an economic crisis, which is what we're probably going to be facing again in the next few years, means that communities have to become even more resilient and think about this even more. So the tide will turn. You're part of a much bigger movement, and I think it's really fantastic that you're doing this. I think it's fantastic that you have these meetings, and just don't give up. Keep on fighting. That's all I can say, and how much I admire you, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today.